The summer the well fields of Harlan County went dry, every grain farmer in the valley learned the same lesson at the same hour, that the man who had laughed loudest in the spring was the man who wept most quietly in August. But that reckoning belongs to the end of the story. The beginning belongs to a cellar and to a woman who stood at its door in the early weeks of April with $3.40 in her coat pocket and the deed to 41 acres of exhausted-looking land in her hand, and to everything her father had sealed underground before the illness took him and the county tax board took the rest. Her name was Della Marsh, and she had arrived in Harlan County the way trouble arrives in a house, quietly through a side door, while everybody was looking somewhere else. She had driven a borrowed truck 9 hours north from the city, where she had spent the previous 4 years working inventory logistics at a food distribution warehouse, a job that paid her enough to live on and taught her more than anyone intended about what things were worth when supply ran short. She was 31 years old, plain-spoken, and possessed of a stillness that most people in a room full of strangers will misread as emptiness. She was not empty, she was listening. Her father, Lionel Marsh, had died in January, owing $4,200 in back property taxes, which the county had collected by auctioning the farmhouse and the barn and the north pasture and the equipment shed and nearly everything else attached to the property except for the 41 acres on the creek side of the road and the low, half-buried stone building at the back of those acres that the county assessor had listed on the auction paperwork as a disused root cellar of negligible value. The 41 acres and the cellar had sold at the residual auction for exactly $3 because no one else bid, and Della had bid because her father's last letter, written in the cramped handwriting of a man who could no longer hold a pen without pain, had told her to. The letter had said, "The root cellar is not a root cellar. I sealed what I sealed, and I kept what I kept, and it has been doing what it does for 11 years without me asking it to. The land remembers what the farmer forgets. You only have to listen. Do not let Aldrich Pruitt tell you otherwise, because Aldrich Pruitt has only ever listened to his own voice, and that particular echo has made him rich, and it will one day make him ruinous. I am sorry I cannot explain more. Come and listen." She had come. She had listened. She had not yet understood what she was listening to. The morning after she arrived, she walked the 41 acres in the kind of silence that only exists in early April, when the frost has not yet entirely surrendered to the warming ground, and the birds have not yet decided to stay. The land looked to any conventional eye like a disappointment. The creek ran low and brown along the eastern edge. The soil was pale and compacted in the open areas, and dark and spongy in the low places near the creek where water pooled but did not drain. The fence was down in 3 places. The access track from the road was rutted 6 inches deep. There were no structures worth the name except for the cellar, which was built of limestone blocks, fitted without mortar in the old way, with a wooden door hung on iron pintles and a hasp lock for which she found the key inside her father's letter, taped to the envelope flap. She opened the cellar on that first morning and stood in the doorway for a long time before she went inside. What her father had sealed in that cellar was not food, was not equipment, was not money or documents or anything a person raised on practical thinking would have predicted. What her father had sealed in that cellar over the course of 11 years of quiet solitary work was a culture. Specifically, a living mother culture of Leuconostoc mesenteroides and Lactobacillus plantarum, and a handful of other organisms whose Latin names Lionel Marsh had copied into a notebook from a university extension pamphlet, and never once pronounced aloud, being a man who trusted his nose over his tongue in most matters. He had been making fermented vegetables. He had built along the western wall of the cellar 67 earthenware crocks of various sizes, each sealed with a cloth and weight lid in the old style, each containing a different experiment in lacto-fermented produce, cabbage and turnip and beet and wild onion and 3 varieties of dried pepper and combinations of all of these that had no name in any cookbook Della had ever seen. The crocks were old. The oldest ones, according to the date scratched into the clay near the base, had been going for 9 years. The cellar smelled alive. It smelled like something between bread and vinegar and earth and something else she could not name, something that had no bad intention in it. She stood in the doorway with the cool April air pressing against her back, and she thought, this is what he meant. She did not yet know what it was worth. She knew only that it was alive, and that it had been alive without him for 3 months, while the county auctioned off everything else, and that nothing in that cellar had died. She did the arithmetic that first evening, sitting on the floor of the cellar with a lantern and her father's notebook. 67 crocks. The smallest held perhaps 4 pounds of product, the largest perhaps 40. She estimated a total of somewhere between 900 and 1,200 pounds of fermented goods in various stages of readiness. She had $3.40. Her truck had a quarter tank of fuel. She had 41 acres of land nobody wanted, a lease she owed to nobody, and a skill she had not known she possessed until she spent 2 hours tasting her father's work, and understood, in the wordless way that a person sometimes understands a thing before they can explain it, that what she was eating was extraordinary. Not merely edible, not merely preserved, but extraordinary in the particular way that a thing is extraordinary when someone has given it 11 years of patient, unhurried attention and asked nothing back but time. The arithmetic of inheritance, she wrote in the margin of his notebook, is not the arithmetic you were taught in school. She would return to that line. She met Aldrich Pruitt the following week at the Grange supply store in town, which was the only place within 20 miles that sold the particular size of canning lids she needed. He was standing at the counter when she came in, talking to the store owner in the unhurried way of a man who understood that other people's time was less valuable than his own. He was 54 years old, broad through the chest, with a handshake that came out before he was introduced, as if it were a reflex. He ran a company called Pruitt Valley Provisions, which contracted with 17 farms in the county to process and distribute preserved goods, pickles, jams, relishes, under a private label that appeared in 3 regional grocery chains. He was, by the frank assessment of everyone in the valley, the most powerful single economic actor in Harlan County's agricultural economy. He was also, by the frank assessment of everyone who had ever negotiated with him, a man who understood the word fair to mean whatever arrangement left him with the larger half. He asked her what she was doing out at the old marsh place. She told him she had inherited it. He expressed condolences about her father in a tone that contained no actual sorrow, and moved immediately to the subject he had clearly wanted to discuss, which was whether she had given any thought to selling the creekside acreage, because Pruitt Valley Provisions had a standing interest in that parcel as a potential drainage easement, and he was prepared to offer her $4,000 for the 41 acres, which was well above assessed value, which she should consider seriously, given that the land was producing nothing, and was likely to produce nothing, and which he would put in writing that afternoon if she said the word. She said, "I appreciate that." He waited for more. She said, "I'll think on it." He gave her a card and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, and told the store owner as she was leaving, in a tone pitched to Carrie, that Lionel's daughter seemed like a decent enough girl, but that she had no idea what she'd walked into out there, and that grief did funny things to a person's judgment, and that he'd give her 3 months before she came back to him, with her hat in her hand. The store owner said nothing. He was a man who had worked out long ago that Aldrich Pruitt was the sort of person you agreed with, until he left the room. Della heard every word. She did not turn around. The first 2 months were the kind of hard that does not announce itself as hardship in any single moment, but accumulates in the body like sediment, so that you wake one morning unable to precisely identify the source of your exhaustion because it is everywhere. She repaired the fence alone using posts she salvaged from the collapsed equipment shed and wire she bought on account at the supply store. She cleared the access track with a rented machine she returned 2 days early to save on the daily rate. She learned the cellar. She learned it the way her father's notebook told her to learn it, by smell and by taste, and by the weight of the lids and by the sound the cultures made, which was a sound somewhere between a sigh and a breath, barely audible but consistent, a low biological respiration that she began to hear as a kind of pulse. She maintained the temperature of the cellar, which required nothing more than leaving the door cracked at night and closed during the heat of the day, and occasionally hanging a wet cloth across the threshold when the April afternoons ran warm. The cultures did not ask for much. They asked only to be left alone, to do what they had been doing for years. She nearly lost the thread in the 5th week when a crack appeared in the largest crock, and she spent an evening convinced the whole project was fragile in ways she had not calculated, and that the arithmetic of inheritance was the arithmetic of losing what you thought you had. She sat outside the cellar door in the dark and listened to the creak and felt the particular despair of a person who has traveled a long distance on someone else's promise and arrived to find the promise exactly as advertised and still somehow less solid than she needed it to be. Then one of the crocks in the 2nd row, the one her father had labeled simply Turnip and Wild Garlic Year 4 in his cramped handwriting, made a sound. It was a small sound, a faint pop, the lid lifting fractionally and resettling as a new bubble of carbon dioxide released and found its way out, the way living things do. She put her hand on the lid. She felt it breathe. She did not cry. She went inside and repaired the cracked crock with a food-grade clay compound she found in a box under the bench, and she went to sleep, and in the morning she was still there. She met Olena Kovalenko in the 3rd week of May, when Olena appeared at the fence line with a bundle of dried dill tied with twine, and a look on her face that suggested she had been intending to come for some time, and had only now gotten around to it. Olena was 78 years old, born in a village in Ukraine that no longer existed under its original name, and she had been living on the 11 acres adjacent to the creek side of the marsh property for 30 years, gardening in a way that the county extension office considered eccentric, and her neighbors considered more or less harmless. She handed the dill through the fence without preamble, and said, "Your father used my grandmother's method for the beet crocks." I showed him. He was a good student. He listened. Della said, "Can you show me what he might have missed?" Olena considered this. She said, "A student who asks what was missed before knowing what was learned is a student worth teaching. Come, we start with the salt." She came every Tuesday morning through May and June, arriving at the fence line with something different each time: a cutting of horseradish root, a paper packet of particular mustard seed, a small jar of something cloudy and sharp that she called starter, as if the cultures in the cellar needed an introduction to older relatives. She spoke in a gentle, accented cadence that had the rhythm of someone translating not merely between languages, but between ways of understanding. She said, "The ferment does not work for you. The ferment works for itself. You only make conditions. Like a landlord who does not raise the rent, the tenants stay and do good work." She said, "My grandfather kept a cellar like this under the house in the village. When the hard winter came and the supply roads were closed for 6 weeks, the cellar fed 30 people. Not the pantry, not the preserved meats, the cellar. Because alive food gives what dead food cannot." She said, "The land remembers what the farmer forgets. Your father understood this. He only needed someone to say it plainly so he could stop feeling strange about knowing it." Della wrote every word in the margins of her father's notebook. She did not write them down because she feared forgetting. She wrote them down because writing a thing is a different kind of listening. The child arrived in the 2nd week of June. His name was Marcus, and he was 9 years old, and he lived with his grandmother in a house a half-mile down the creek road because his mother was working in a city 3 states away, and his father was a subject his grandmother declined to discuss. He appeared one afternoon at the edge of the track, simply standing there, watching, with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that stillness is safer than motion. Della looked up from where she was moving crocks along the west wall and said, "You want to come in?" He came in. He looked at the crocks for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "They're all different." She said, "That's right." He said, "Do they have names?" She said she hadn't thought about it. He named them. Not formally, not in a ceremony, but gradually over the following weeks, in the way children build vocabulary, by observation and by pattern and by instinct. The large turnip crock near the door he called the General, because it was the biggest and because the lid on it was heavier than any of the others and required both hands to lift. The beet crock with the deep burgundy brine that stained everything it touched he called the Bishop, for reasons he could not articulate, but that seemed correct to everyone who heard it. The small experimental crock of fermented green tomato and wild mustard that his father's notebook had marked simply as uncertain he called the Uncertain. And Della laughed, which was something she had not done since April, and which surprised her enough that she noted the date in the margin of the notebook. Marcus came every afternoon that the weather allowed, and occasionally when it did not. He carried lids. He swept the cellar floor. He fetched the wet cloth for the door frame on hot afternoons without being asked, having worked out for himself why it was necessary. He did not talk very much, but when he talked, it was worth hearing. He said once, watching Della adjust the weights on a row of new crocks she had packed herself using Olena's method, "It smells like it's thinking." Della considered this for a while and said, "You might be right." The discovery came on a morning in early July. It did not announce itself. Della had been tasting her way through the older crocks systematically, the way she did every 2 weeks, using a small ceramic spoon and her father's notebook open beside her, and when she lifted the lid of the crock, her father had labeled simply the long one, because it was a cylindrical crock longer than it was wide, salvaged from some previous use she could not identify. She tasted something that stopped her entirely. She sat on the stone bench with the spoon in her hand and the crock open before her, and she tasted it again and then a third time, and what she understood was this. Whatever her father had put in the long crock 11 years ago and sealed and left to work had become, through time and the particular ambient culture of that cellar and the mineral quality of the creek-filtered groundwater that he had apparently been using as his brine base, something she had no adequate frame for. It was not cabbage exactly, though cabbage was likely part of it. It was not vinegar, though the acidity was present and clean. It tasted like depth. It tasted like a thing that had been given all the time it needed and had used every minute. She closed the crock. She told nobody. She wrote in the notebook, "The long one is ready. This is what he was waiting for." She wrote, "The arithmetic of inheritance compounds if you let it." Then she closed the notebook and went out and repaired a fence post that did not need repairing and thought about what to do next, which was the most important hour she had spent in Harlan County so far. What she did next was wait. She continued as she had been, maintaining the cellar, working the ferments, buying supplies on account at the store in town, driving past Pruitt Valley Provisions on the county road, and noting that its loading dock was busy every morning with refrigerated trucks taking on product. She said nothing about the long crock. She was banking it the way you bank a fire under ash, present, alive, not yet deployed. The outside validator came in the 3rd week of August, 3.5 months after Della's arrival, in the form of a woman named Carmela Voss, who was the head chef and co-owner of a restaurant in the city 2 hours south that had, over the preceding 5 years, developed a serious regional reputation for doing serious things with fermented and preserved ingredients. Carmela had heard about Lionel Marsh's cellar from an older cook who had passed through Harlan County the previous autumn, and eaten something at the county fair that she had been describing inaccurately, but with great enthusiasm, ever since. Carmela had driven up on a Tuesday morning on a theory and introduced herself at the cellar door with the direct confidence of a person who trusts her instincts and knows that trust has cost her nothing she regrets. Della let her taste her way through the cellar. She saved the long crock for last. Carmela stood over the long crock for what Della later estimated at 4 full minutes, tasting and thinking, and then she said, "What do you want for it?" Della named a number. It was not a modest number. It was the number she had arrived at by working backward from what she understood the product to be and what she understood scarcity to mean in a market where this product did not currently exist at any price. It was the number she had written in the margin of the notebook next to the line about compounding arithmetic, and she had written it down 3 weeks earlier so she would not be tempted to revise it downward in the moment. Carmela looked at her for a moment and then said, "For the whole crock?" Della said. "For a standing monthly order of whatever I can produce to that quality. The long crock is the proof of what the cellar does over time. What I sell you will be younger and therefore somewhat different, but the method is the same, and the culture is the same, and the water is the same, and given a year, you will not be able to tell the difference." Carmela said, "A year is a long time to trust a promise." Della said, "You've been in the cellar for 40 minutes, and you've already made your decision. I'm just telling you the terms." Carmela smiled. She wrote a check for the deposit, a number that represented more money than Della had earned in any single month of her working life, for 12 pounds of product from the secondary crocks and a verbal agreement on the standing order. And she drove 2 hours back south with the general, buckled into the passenger seat of her car in a cooler, which Della would later learn Carmela described to her business partner as the strangest and best procurement decision she had ever made. Della stood in the cellar after Carmela left and did the arithmetic one more time. She could service the standing order. She could expand production using the creek water and Olena's method and the extended culture from the active crocks. She could, in 3 years, be operating at a scale that would make the cellar self-sustaining and profitable by any conventional measure. She wrote in the margin of the notebook, "The arithmetic of inheritance is patience applied to time." She was quiet for a while. Then she wrote, "He knew." The drought arrived in September the way Olena had described it the previous spring. Not gradually, not with warning, but with the immediacy of a door thrown open into a furnace, so that the air changed quality from 1 week to the next, and the creek fell a foot, and then another foot, and the soil in the open fields went from parched to cracked to something closer to ceramic, and the farmers of Harlan County who grew their living in the earth watched it happen with the particular stunned attention of people who have been told a thing is possible and have never quite believed it until they are standing inside it. The valley's conventional agricultural operations began failing in October. The grain fields were already marginal from the dry summer. The fall vegetable harvest was the worst in 14 years by the metric of every farmer who kept records, which was most of them because the county extension office required it for subsidy eligibility. The cold storage operations that fed Pruitt Valley Provisions' supply chain ran low by November, and the 3 regional grocery chains that carried Pruitt's private label product began receiving reduced shipments and making inquiries, which Aldridge Pruitt handled with the smooth professional equanimity of a man who had navigated tight seasons before, and who had, in the meantime, been engaged in a different kind of navigation entirely. He had been watching Della's operation. Della did not know this precisely until November, when he appeared at the gate of the access track unannounced on a Thursday morning and made his second offer, which was for the 41 acres plus the cellar and all contents and the notebook and whatever standing commercial relationship she had developed for $22,000, payable in 30 days, with a non-compete agreement covering fermented goods in a 12-county radius for 7 years. He framed this as generous. He said, "I want to be straight with you. I've got an emergency consolidation fund, and I'm using it for properties in the valley that are underutilized, and your situation out here is—" He paused, selecting the word with care. "Precarious, and I want to help you make a sound decision before the season gets any harder on you." Della looked at him. She said, "You said precarious." He said, "I did." She said, "How many crocks did you count?" He said, "I'm sorry?" She said, "When you were here, at the cellar. I want to know how many crocks you counted." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know what you mean." She said, "There are 67 crocks in that cellar. The number is not visible from the door. It's not in any document I've filed with the county. It's not something you could arrive at by guessing or by standing at the fence line with a long lens, because the angle doesn't permit a count. You could only have that number from inside the cellar or from someone who was inside the cellar, and the only people who have been inside that cellar are me and Marcus Dubois and Elena Kovalenko and Carmela Voss, and none of those 4 people would have given it to you. So I'm wondering when you were here and what you were looking at." He held her gaze for 3 seconds, and then he said, "I think you have a very stressful situation here, and I think you're letting it make you see things that aren't there." She said, "I appreciate your time. You know where the gate is." He left. She wrote in the notebook, 67. He said, 67. She put the number in a circle, and she went back to work. The pressure came in 3 waves after that, the way pressure from that kind of man always comes, because men like Aldrich Pruitt have studied the distance between discomfort and capitulation, and they have learned to apply force in increments. The first wave was rumor. She heard through Marcus's grandmother that there was talk in town about the creek water being the source of a possible contamination issue, unspecified, origin unspecified, and that Pruitt had mentioned it to the county health office as a concern worth looking into. The second wave was civic. The county road authority sent a letter advising her that the access track from the county road to her property might be subject to reclassification as a private easement requiring a separate use permit, a process that would take 3 to 6 months and would in the interim restrict commercial vehicle access. She called the county road office and spoke to a clerk who was embarrassed and eventually admitted that the inquiry had originated from a third-party complaint rather than from any routine review. The third wave was financial. Pruitt Valley Provisions stopped extending commercial credit to the supply store on a technicality related to invoicing, and the supply store owner, who was not a bad man, but who was a man with a mortgage and a dependent business relationship, told Della in an apologetic and roundabout way that he was going to need her to clear her account balance before he could continue supplying her on account terms. Her account balance was $412. She paid it. She had the money from Carmela's deposit. She did not say anything to the store owner that he would have to remember later with embarrassment, because she understood that he was a person caught between forces, and that being caught between forces was not a moral failing. The first humbled man came to her gate on the first Friday of December. His name was Boyd Calloway, and he was a farmer who had been at the county supply store on the day she bought her first canning lids, and he had laughed then, openly and without meanness, the specific laugh of a person who finds an absurdity at such an obvious level that the laughing feels involuntary. He had laughed at a city woman driving a borrowed truck to rescue a root cellar full of what Aldrich Pruitt had called, in Boyd's hearing and in the hearing of several others, Old Man Marsh's jar collection. Boyd was not a cruel man. He was a man who had laughed at something he didn't understand, which is a different but related thing, and the difference had not seemed important in the spring. It seemed important now. He stood at the gate with his hat in his hands, literally in his hands, not on his head, the posture of a man who has decided before arriving that humility is the only available currency. And he said, "I've got my wife's mother coming for Christmas, and 3 families on the road who've had a bad harvest, and I heard you might have product to sell, and I don't have much to offer you, but I've got labor, and I've got a truck, and if you need something hauled or something built or something fixed, I can do that." She opened the gate. She brought him into the cellar and showed him the secondary crocks that were ready, the turnip and onion, the beet, the mild cabbage, and she sold him 40 pounds of fermented goods at a price that was fair, and that was not the price she could have charged given the scarcity and the season, and she accepted 4 hours of fence repair as part of the exchange. And she sent him home with enough for his family and for 3 families down the road. And he drove away from her gate with his hat back on his head and a look on his face that she could see in the rearview mirror of her own truck as she watched him go. A look that was not gratitude exactly, but was the thing that comes before gratitude, recognition. More people came, not many at first, and then more. The word moved along the creek road the way water moves along a dry stream bed after rain, tentatively at first, finding the path, and then with increasing confidence. She sold only what she could spare from the secondary crocks, carefully keeping the culture intact and the production levels sustainable. She kept exact records in the notebook. She charged fair prices and accepted labor in exchange when that was what people had. She declined to gouge. She declined multiple times explicitly in situations where the arithmetic of the moment made gouging not merely possible, but almost compulsory. She wrote in the notebook, "The arithmetic of inheritance is not what you extract. It is what you leave in the ground." The reckoning came on the second Saturday of December at the Grange Hall, which was where the county held its emergency agricultural session to address the drought conditions and the supply chain failures affecting the valley. It was called by the county commissioner at the request of a coalition of farmers, and it was attended by approximately 60 people. And Aldridge Pruitt arrived with 2 associates from Pruitt Valley Provisions and a proposed consolidation arrangement that he had clearly been preparing for several weeks, which involved the county purchasing a first right of acquisition on all small fermented goods operations in the valley under an emergency economic stabilization ordinance that he had, it emerged gradually and then suddenly, drafted himself through a connection with the county commissioner's office, and circulated without public notice. The arrangement would have given Pruitt Valley Provisions effective control over Della's operation and 3 other small operations in the valley through a county intermediary that would negotiate supply contracts on their behalf, with Pruitt Valley Provisions as the exclusive regional distributor. Della sat in the 3rd row and listened. She let him present. She waited until he finished and took questions from the room, which were generally the questions of people who do not fully understand what is being proposed, but who sense something wrong in the proposal the way an animal senses weather before the sky changes. Then she stood up. She said, "Mr. Pruitt has told you this arrangement will stabilize the valley's supply situation. I want to ask him a question about that, and I want him to tell me in front of this room what he knows about my operation specifically, since he's offered to stabilize it twice in the last 2 months, and he says he's been evaluating operations throughout the valley for this plan." Pruitt said, "I haven't discussed your operation specifically in this presentation." She said, "No, you haven't. You've described it as one of several small fermented goods operations. How many crocks do I have in my cellar, Mr. Pruitt?" The room was quiet. He said, "I don't see how that's relevant." She said, "It's relevant because you gave me that number in October when you came to my gate. You said precarious situation. You offered to consolidate. You used the number 67, which is the count of crocks in my cellar, and you cannot have that number unless you were on my property without my permission. I'm asking you to tell this room how you got it, and I'm asking the county commissioner to note that the man proposing to stabilize this valley's agricultural economy was conducting unauthorized surveillance of a competitor's operation while simultaneously lobbying for the emergency ordinance that would give him control of it." The room was not quiet in the way it had been quiet before. It was quiet the way a room is quiet when 60 people are all arriving at the same conclusion simultaneously, and none of them want to be the first to say it. Pruitt said something about coincidence and about numbers being publicly estimable and about the hostile framing of her characterization, and the more he said, the smaller he became in the room, because every additional sentence was a sentence in which he failed to deny the specific number, and the specific number was the fact, and facts of that kind have a weight that eloquence cannot balance. The county commissioner, who was an old farmer himself and who had been watching Aldridge Pruitt operate in Harlan County for 15 years with the wary respect of a man who knows a larger animal shares his range, tabled the ordinance. He did this without ceremony, in 4 words, "We'll table that motion." And the room exhaled. Pruitt left before the session ended, walking out with his 2 associates in the rigid way of a man who is very angry and who has decided that dignity requires he express it as contempt rather than defeat. No one in the room said anything as he left. No one needed to. When he was gone, Della stood again. She said, "I have product available. I have approximately 340 pounds of fermented goods in various stages of readiness in my cellar, and I have the culture and the method to continue producing at that level indefinitely provided the creek water holds, which it will because the creek is fed from the limestone aquifer, and it has not dropped below 3 inches of flow in the 14 years of records my father kept. I am not going to sell that product to a distributor for a margin that leaves the valley dependent on a single buyer. What I am going to do is this." She read from the notebook. She had written it the previous evening in the kitchen of the stone farmhouse, which she had been renting from the property's new owner, an older woman in the city who had bought it at the auction, and who had been willing to lease the farmhouse back at a modest rate once she understood the situation. She had written a price per pound for the secondary crocks, and a price per pound for the longer-aged product, and a schedule for distribution over the following 3 months that would cover approximately 40 families at subsistence purchase levels. And she had written at the bottom of the page in her father's handwriting style, "Not charity, exchange. Bring what you can. Labor, supplies, seed, fair coin." The cellar fed 30 people in a hard winter in a village that no longer exists. It will do the same here. She did not use those last lines aloud. She did not need to. She read the prices and the schedule, and when she sat down, Boyd Calloway, who was sitting in the second row, removed his hat. He did not say anything. He simply held it in his hands, the gesture already familiar to her from December, and 2 or 3 people around him did the same, the quiet, unconscious solidarity of people who have recognized something worth honoring and do not yet have words for it. She looked for Elena in the room and found her near the back wall, standing because the hall was full and there were no chairs left, a small figure in a dark coat with her hands folded in front of her. Elena met her gaze and nodded once, the nod of a teacher watching a student arrive at something the teacher could not have given them directly. Marcus was not in the hall. He was 9 years old, and it was a Saturday evening, and his grandmother had determined that county agricultural meetings were not for children and had left him at home, where Della suspected he was reading a book with the lamp on in the kitchen window and the creek audible through the glass and the whole winter quiet around him. She thought about telling him later what the room had been like. She thought he would listen well. The rains came in January. They came slowly, the way real relief always comes after the kind of waiting that recalibrates what you consider normal, and the creek rose back to its summer level by the 2nd week of February, and the soil of Harlan County accepted the moisture with the particular gratitude of a thing that has been thirsty for a long time and knows the taste of water for exactly what it is. Della expanded the cellar in the spring, not the building, which was sound and did not need expanding, but the operation, adding a 2nd row of crocks along the north wall and a 3rd culture batch, using Elena's older starter and the creek water, and the mineral character of that particular piece of ground. She registered the standing order with Carmela Voss as a formal commercial agreement with a food handler's permit and a county business license obtained without incident, the county health office having found, upon inspection, precisely nothing of concern and precisely a great deal of careful, methodical, sanitary practice. The access track easement question resolved itself when the county road authority reviewed the complaint and closed it for lack of substantive basis, which the clerk communicated to her by letter in the same embarrassed tone he had used on the phone. Boyd Calloway built her a second tool shed that spring. Good work, solid timber, no charge. His wife sent a jar of honey with it. Della planted the note from the honey jar in the back of her father's notebook, where it would stay. On a Tuesday morning in early May, Olena arrived at the fence line with a cutting of something Della had not seen before. A particular variety of wild fennel from her grandmother's garden, propagated from seed across 3 generations and 1 ocean, and handed it through the wire with the ceremony of someone transferring something valuable and knowing it. She said, "Your father would have used this in the long crock. He did not know to ask. I am telling you now because you know to listen." Della took the cutting. She said, "What does it do?" Olena said, "What does anything do if you give it time and good conditions and do not ask it to hurry? It becomes what it is. The cellar will tell you when it is ready." Della walked back down the access track to the cellar with the fennel cutting in her hand and the morning light coming flat and gold across the 41 acres and the creek running clear over limestone, and the door of the cellar open to the spring air because the temperature was exactly right and needed no management. She stood at the threshold for a moment and listened. The cultures breathed. The long crock breathed. The general breathed, lid slightly ajar because Marcus had been there the afternoon before and had lifted it and set it back at the half-centimeter gap he had determined through experiment was the optimal ventilation for that particular crock in spring conditions, and had been right. She went inside. She opened the notebook to the last page with writing on it, and she read the line she had written first. The arithmetic of inheritance is not the arithmetic you were taught in school. She read the line she had written in July. The arithmetic of inheritance compounds if you let it. She read the line she had written in October. The arithmetic of inheritance is patience applied to time. She read the line she had written in December. The arithmetic of inheritance is not what you extract. It is what you leave in the ground. She wrote one more line. She wrote it under all the others, in the margin where her father had kept his own notes and where there was still a small space remaining. She wrote, "He was right. Come and listen." Then she closed the notebook and set it on the stone bench where it had always been, and she went to work.
C'est la nourrice. Ok, merci, Nick. Nike? Nick. Ouais, ça m'a l'air un peu compliqué parfois, hein, j'avoue. Ok, donc ça, c'est toute la bande là qui est contre nous. Ok. Est-il possible que... Donc Drake, c'est le frère de la petite jeune, là. Nika, ok. Okay. Elle est jolie, hein. Voilà, c'est ce que je vous disais tout à l'heure dans le résumé. Voilà, elle aime son frère, mais